Hello and welcome. I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're talking about the Romantic era. That is the era between the Regency era and the Victorian era. And we're making a dress from just as Victoria ascends the throne, so the very, very end of the Romantic era. Fashion-wise, the Romantic era is a very wild and playful time. But to understand how we really got there, we have to look at the later Regency era, the 19 teens. And well, first of all, in the Regency era, we have the high empire waist and the long flowy skirts. But in the 19 teens, these skirts start to have a little bit more structure and the hems get a little bit more shorter so that sometimes they can actually reveal the ankle completely, but sometimes they're still close to ground level. And the way these hems get their structure and get that more of a bell shape to them is not only patterning, but also in stuff and structural details in the hem itself. In the form usually of tucks, the hem can be quite heavily pin tucked, just a few inches off the ground, so that would give, because the fabric in a pin tuck, the fabric is doubled and then stitched. That gives it a lot more structure and makes the hem a lot or the hem area a lot thicker so that it will hold its shape better. And another thing that they often did they would pad roll. That is basically putting a roll of fabric that has padding in it, kind of like quilting, but in a roll form. And that would hold out the skirt in a much more structured way. And at the same time as this was happening to the hems, the sleeves were starting to get bigger and poofier. You see poofy sleeves earlier in the Regency era, but they usually tend to be very much a poof up here, and then a fairly slim sleeve the rest of the way down. But during the 18 teens, throughout the decade, the sleeve just gets bigger all over so that it has a more distinct poof, and it starts to gain also size throughout the sleeve, in long sleeves especially. And while this is happening in the 18 teens, once we get to the 1820s, the hems are really always structured and very bell-shaped at the bottom. And the waistlines start to drop at this point too. And the sleeves are still getting bigger and bigger at the top so that there's more and more poof. And by the time we reach 1830, that is when the sleeve is at its biggest for about 29 to 32, 33-ish. And that's really the biggest moment for the Gigot sleeve. Sleeves are absolutely huge in this era. Like a yard of fabric for one sleeve is common. And the way these sleeves are cut, that is literally like a yard of fabric in the sleeve. There is no waist. It is cut in a way that this forearm portion just happens out of the same yard, and all of the rest of the fabric is just that sleeve poof up here. And of course, to hold up that ginormous sleeve, you need some sort of support. So they came up with all kinds of support systems. Oftentimes you see supports that basically are giant down feather pillows on your arms. But also there are other options. There are different kinds of cages that you can wear, kind of like a skirt crinoline, but for your sleeves. And these especially seem to have been popular for evening styles. You can see that even evening styles with the shorter sleeves in this era kind of also have this thing going on where you kind of have an almost triangular shape to the sleeve. And also, of course, when there is such a huge sleeve, you need something to balance that out. So that's where the skirts come in. At this point, skirts are much fuller than they were even in the 1820s. And the way, because anymore the padding and that at the hem can't really hold up the weight of the skirt to keep it in that bell shape. And also the bell starting higher and higher, closer to the waist. So in order to keep that shape up, Instead of using structures on the outer skirt, you use the structures on the inner skirt in the form of a corded petticoat. These corded petticoats often came with quite dense cording at the bottom, and they could be corded quite far up, but sometimes it was mostly just at the bottom, focused on the bottom. And another option, if you didn't want to go for a corded petticoat, or if it was colder, or you just wanted to add even more oomph, is that you could wear a quilted petticoat, much like in the 18th century. At this point, the waistlines are fairly close to the waistline. They're either at your actual natural waistline or just a slightly bit raised. That depends a lot on your personal measurements. Like, for instance, because I'm short-waisted, if I would put it a little bit higher than my natural waist, it would very easily look like almost a Regency silhouette. So I keep mine pretty much at the waist. But, for somebody with a longer torso, you might still want to go a little bit raised, because you're kind of going for, a fairy princess shape. The look is very much what I at least associate in my head to fairies. And that silhouette is basically what we're going for in the early part of the 1830s. Basically, those ginormous sleeves are kind of like a fairy's wings. Like, that's the look you're going for. It's like, collectively, we just as a society decided that this is the point, we're done with, like, normal fashion. We're going as wild as possible. One big reason for why fashion became so wild and wacky was because earlier in history, people could always show their wealth with fabrics. Silk was very expensive, but also just dyes were very expensive. Fabric in general was very, very expensive, and poor people couldn't afford as much. And when the rise of the middle classes really happens in this, say, 17th and 18th centuries, the middle classes start to be dressed better and better, and then on top of that, the upper classes would start dressing, especially their house servants, very well, because they thought that that was kind of an extension of showing their wealth, that look, even my lady's maid is dressed this well. And that's when people really started complaining that it was impossible to anymore tell what your social status was by looking at your dress. That there was ladies' maids and shopkeepers' wives that were as well dressed as the finest ladies in town. And this really bothered the rich. So, of course, they couldn't just live with the fact that, poorer people could dress the same as them. Of course, they had to evolve their fashion to be more outrageous so that the poorer people couldn't emulate that. And the way they started at first in the 1780s and later on in the Regency era was wearing a lot of white and wearing long trains, which if you were a working class woman, even if you could afford the dress, you couldn't afford to constantly be washing your dresses and put in the effort and time that goes into cleaning a white train and keeping that clean and not getting it soiled. And because, you couldn't be carrying around your train if you have a bunch of stuff in your hands because you're actually, doing stuff. That's one way that the rich people decided to keep the poor people from being able to emulate their fashion. But then when that started to fail and fashion moved forward, the way that they came up with was basically have so outrageous fashion because they have the drop shoulder and the ginormous sleeves with the ginormous sleeve supporters. You just really can't work. There's just no way. Like, even if your arm movement is slightly restricted, you can pattern it in a way that you can touch your head, but you can't have the same arm reach. It just doesn't really, because if the sleeve is patterned in a way that it can basically handle it, and even if you pull it up on your shoulder so that doesn't restrict you, you have the ginormous arm pillow, and that's going to hit your head. So it simply doesn't work. So that was a way for the wealthy to show, I'm rich enough to not work. I'm of the leisure class. The poor people simply cannot emulate this fashion because they have to actually be able to do things with their hands other than just, fancy needlework and things like this that was acceptable work for the leisure classes. But because this fashion was so outrageous looking and so wild, especially because they added really wild hair to it, by the time they get to 1835, it seems like we as a society just went, okay, that is a little bit too much. Like, for the last 10 years, we've been just trying to outdo ourselves in outrageousness. Let's take a step back. Like, that's a bit much. We need a break. And the thing that they start doing is hems start to lengthen again, so that because most of the early 1830s, most hems have actually been short enough to show your ankles. Hems start to get closer to the ankle or even covering the ankle completely so that they get to the top of the foot. On top of this, sleeves, the poof kind of just, instead of being up there and being wild and in your face, it goes his size. And it just drops down your sleeve. And the way they do this is not by actually changing the patterning. Well, they don't do the ginormous biggest Gigot sleeve anymore. But they do the big sleeve patterning and they start ruching the top bit to make that fit in closer to the arm so that the poof lowers down lower and lower and lower. You can sometimes see multiple poofs on the lower arm. And by about the early 1840s, that poof has disappeared completely. It is sometimes replaced by a shorter cap sleeve that is on top of the sleeve. But the sleeve itself is fairly tight. And during the 1840s, it gets first tighter and tighter until it starts again forming a bell shape on the bottom, but then the wrist does not become tight in that sleeve anymore. Those last years of the 1830s and first years of the 1840s are kind of an interesting time in fashion because in one way the silhouette is starting to get more and more severe. It still has the big skirts. The big skirts continue and they eventually will grow into the size that requires a crinoline or hoop skirt. But the outer bodice becomes more and more severe. But there is still playfulness in this era. And because of the poofs and all the ruching details, it is a very interesting time in fashion. And there's a lot of variety in how it's done. I decided to make a replica of a gown. Well, it's not an exact replica, but as close as I can get with the silk I had at hand. This is actually the leftover silk from my wedding dress back in 2010. This original dress is housed in the Met, and though it is dated to the early 1840s, I actually believe it might be slightly earlier because there's still so much of the poof left. So that's why I'm personally dating this from 37 to 40 or 41.
I cut my pattern pieces out of a glazed cotton for the lining and a silk for the outer fabric. Then I sew up the bodice pieces. And then I cut open the darts and notch the remaining seam allowances so that they can lie flat. And then I try on the bodice to make sure it fits correctly. Excuse my slightly crooked pinning. That is what causes some of the puckering, and some of the underarm puckering is because the seam allowance is still there. And next I cut the bodice ruching out of the silk. And make piping for the center front and all the edges out of linen, cord, and silk. And and sew gathering threads all along the bodice front ruching pieces. Then I mark the other side to try to get the ruching lines to match up. Then I sew the two front ruching pieces together with a piping in between. Next I gather up the ruching to match the bodice size. And remember to always wax your thread to make hand sewing easier. And then I use a spaced back stitch to sew on the ruching to the bodice. Next I sew the same ruching lines onto the upper edge of the sleeve. Then I pin piping onto the long edge of the sleeve and the sleeve so that it can be sewn together. And then I gather up the sleeve head really tightly and use a needle to push the ends of the gathers to the wrong side and then knot them together with the wrong side's thread. Then I sew piping onto the arm's eye of the bodice and then sew the sleeve onto the bodice. Next, using the buttons I'm going to place inside the silk, I trace and make silk-covered buttons for the back. And make a placket with buttonholes. I sew the placket onto the bodice using a prick stitch. That leaves a tiny little stitch on the right side, but still keeps the placket well in place with a back stitch. Next I add piping to the top and bottom edges of the bodice, and whip the upper edges seam allowances down for a neat finish. And next, because I'm somewhat of an idiot and didn't count my fabric properly, I'll have to piece the upper edge of the skirts to make them the right size. But luckily piecing is period. The hem is faced with a gray cotton sateen. And lastly, I add a hook and eye at the waist to keep the skirts from opening. And here it is, my finished gown. I feel like a gothic novel princess in this gown. The button placket construction was kind of interesting, and I'm still not sure how I feel about that. It kind of shows as I move. The one thing that I would change, if I could, is that I would be more economical when making the sleeves, because I would want to add about an inch to the skirt length, but this one isn't bad as it is either, so I'm okay with it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button because it really does help out in this world. And if you haven't already subscribed, if you'd like to do that, that would be great so that I can see you again next time. Bye!